Hello and welcome to Learn Plus. I am Brenda Bailey Hughes and I'm delighted to welcome you into this month's conversation on storytelling. I do a lot of training and consulting and coaching with different people about presentation skills, about their communication skills. And story is one of my favorite things to talk about. As you are arriving, please let us know in the chat where you're joining us from today. I am in Indiana, which is about 4 hours south of Chicago in the United States, the Midwestern part of the United States. And in February in Indiana, I am accustomed to freezing, ice, snow, and brutally cold weather. And we have this amazing, I'm looking out the window. We have this amazingly sunshiny, blue sky, warm day. So you can bet you, friends, I'm going to have fun with you. And then as soon as we hang up, I'm going to be outside on a hike, I think. We've got folks calling in from Tennessee, hi Shelby, and Somalia, and Atlanta, and Seattle, Washington, Albania. So good to see all of you. We've got Jay here from Italy. It's always great to see you, Jay. So glad you're here. Tell me also maybe in the chat what your interest in storytelling is. Are you using stories for persuasive efforts? Are you using them for presentations? Are you writing your stories? Is this content creation written or verbal for you? Would love to hear more about how you're doing it. Hey, Mike, another Hoosier on the line from Michigan City, north of me. But Mike, I hope you're getting this amazingly off February kind of weather there in Michigan City too. I suspect you are. We've got South Africa, New Zealand, Poland, Colorado in the house, Chile, Brazil. Great. Reading England. Thank you. So glad you're all here. Tell me why you're curious about storytelling. I can tell you one of the reasons I'm curious about storytelling, love using stories in content creation. And this comes from a story of my own. When I do a lot of these communication trainings, one of the things I'll ask people, if I've got a room full of executives, is I'll say, can you tell me a childhood story that was read to you when you were little? And someone will say, oh yeah, I remember Little Red Riding Hood, or the Three Bears and Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And I'll say, well, tell me more about the story. And these executives in their 40s, 50s, or 60s can tell me the tiniest details about that story. You know, they'll remember which way the Little Red Riding Hood character turned off of the path and exactly what the big bad wolf said to grandma. And they've got all of these tiny details locked away in their brains. And then I'll say, okay, that's great. Tell me, what were the figures, the sales figures in the meeting that you had yesterday? And there's this awkward silence because nobody can call it up, or they'll be really generic, like, well, I think we were up. We were up by a couple percent from last quarter, and those sales figures are so much more relevant and pertinent to their life. Why can't they remember those when they can remember a story that doesn't even matter? And I think it's because it was story. If those sales stats had been turned into a story, I suspect there would be much higher recall. So we've got people that are working on, I'm checking out here why you're doing it: persuasive and selling video advertisements, presentations. Okay, good. How to structuring presentations, how to talk about services and business. That needs to be a great story, Shelby. Yes, using storytelling to captivate an audience. Marketing, CJ's using it in a nonprofit and for personal storytelling for funding opportunities. Great. Aaron, hi. Aaron had a great question, by the way, in the registration link. And Aaron, I'm going to answer your question about how do we keep finding good sources of stories so that we don't burn out trying to come up with sources. So I'm going to talk about that at the towards the tail end of our time together, which we'll keep it around 20-30 minutes, I hope, today. Lots of you using them for sales and interviews and presentations, even social interactions. Yeah, I love that, Sydney. This doesn't have to be limited professionally. Our professional socializing is enhanced with storytelling. It's a great way to make yourselves memorable. Anna, for motivating your team. Yeah, great. Okay. So we know that just anecdotally, I know these people in my training sessions can remember stories from decades ago in their lives, but they can't remember data from yesterday. And this really is an anecdotal example of a larger principle, and that is that stories are memorable. And yeah, here we go. Storytelling is memorable. So there was a study done where people were asked to give a 1-minute pitch. So all of you who are using stories for pitches, you're ahead of the game here, because typically when people were asked to make that 1-minute pitch, they would integrate about 2.5, on average, there were 2.5 statistics per 1-minute pitch. 2.5 statistics per 1-minute pitch. Only 1 in 10 pitches included a story. Okay, so we know that a lot of people use stats, very few people were integrating stories. And yet, when we look at the results, the recall just 10 minutes after hearing the pitch was as low as 5% on average for the pitches that were statistic heavy, whereas there was 63% accurate recall for the pitches that had integrated story. So we know that stories increase the likelihood that someone will remember what we said. Okay, so they remember it, but do they act on it? So many of you were using it for driving behavior. You wanted to motivate, you wanted to fundraise, you wanted to get the job you're interviewing for, you wanted to use it for a sales pitch. Does story do anything more than catch our memory? Does it also motivate action? And the answer is it does. So in another study, this one by Deb Wharton, she's a marketing prof out of the Wharton School of Business. She did 2 groups of people, and she asked, in all the subjects were asked to read a pamphlet about the nonprofit organization Save the Children. And they were all offered $5 if they would just read the pamphlet. Now, in one group, the pamphlet was just facts about the organization itself. In the second group, people read those exact same stats about the organization, plus there was one tiny excerpt about a specific child, a little story about a child. When the subjects left, remember they were given $5 to read these pamphlets. Deb Wharton and her crew said, hey, would you be willing to donate the $5 back to Save the Children? Would you guess that in the story condition, the people were 2 times more likely to give than if they had not had that one little story? Exact data, both scenarios. You add a story, you motivate action. So we know that stories increase our memory and they increase the likelihood of action, of activity, of motivating behaviors. So I'm guessing you're here today because you already knew that storytelling had a lot of power, or you wouldn't have been interested in this. I just wanted to give you a few more little tips on our pieces of evidence to back up your gut feeling that stories work. You are right. But then how do we tell a good story is where I want to turn next. And that's where I got the title for today's presentation, the 4 C's of storytelling. So when we think of stories and having these 4 key components, or the 4 C's, they are context, that's the background information, the setup. And one of the most common errors that good storytellers make, or not so good storytellers, I guess, is that we give too much context. We include too much background information before we kind of get to the real action or the real character setup. So if you're finding that your stories are a little long-winded, or you're watching people kind of start to glaze over a little bit when you're telling a story, maybe you could tighten the context up and keep that a little more concise. But you need enough to bring us into the scene with you a bit. The second C is this idea that we need characters. There need to be people in our stories. And even if you're pitching a financially rigorous kind of recommendation is what you're going after, the financial impact within your organization will affect people, either customers, clients, or employees within the organization. Talk about the impacts to the people involved. By painting the picture of the characters, the humans involved, we start to bring people into our story. So we've got context, the setup. we've got our characters, the people who are involved. And don't tell a story without people. It's not a real story. And then there has to be this conflict. And conflict, don't think of it in that very literal sense that would mean, two people fighting with each other, or a good guy and a bad guy even. But it's more, there's this tension point. There's this rising action where people are now so invested in what's happening to those characters that you kind of have them on the edge of their seats. If you stopped talking right there, they'd be like, no, wait, what happens? What happens? You've brought them to that climactic moment of some sort, this tension moment. That's your conflict. And then we can't just leave them hanging there. We have to resolve the story, and that's our conclusion. So we've got context, characters, conflict, and conclusion. I want to show you a clip that I think does a really good job of illustrating these 4 C's, our context, characters, conflict, and conclusion. This is the Apple Sustainability Mother Nature spot. A lot of you've probably seen it. It's a fairly recent ad. Some I know about all of you. I've read a lot of sustainability reports in my life, and they are always so boring. Even though I know the content is important, they're usually a slog to work through. And the creativity of the story format here, and then you could find your 4 C's. Hopefully, I guess we didn't talk about characters. Who were some of the characters that you noticed in the chat? Tell me who the characters were that stood out to you. Mother Nature, of course, played by the brilliant Octavia Spencer, right? Who else was a character in this? And yes, Anna from Poland. We are recording. You can always find it in my feed. Yes, Rita, it's a great video, isn't it? I think it's so creative, and it's such a good demonstration of those 4 C's. Do stories that have humor in them stick better? Jack, not necessarily. Humor is an emotional appeal, so it is an engaging way to keep your audience engaged. But for many of us, humor doesn't just come easily. And if it seems contrived or forced, then I think we're better off without it. But you saw how when some of their stats started to get a little heavy, stat heavy, they broke up that commercial with a few little humorous anecdotes. So yeah, I think it keeps our attention for sure. Yeah, Denny, the percentages were there. There were lots of numbers. Normally we'd be tuning out, and yet instead we're just right there on the edges of our seats, right? So the Apple employees with the plant, she was a great character in here. The CEO was one of the characters. Mother Nature was a character. Mother Nature's sidekick. Yes, there, Madeline just got it. Mother Nature's assistant. I love his role, kind of the tagging along with Mother, starts to get wooed over by the Apple employees, realizes that's not his role, and steps back out. I think a lot of fun there. The guy with the leather jacket, right, that talks about transportation, but she kind of picks on him because he's wearing leather while Apple is trying to reduce their leather usage. Great stuff there. And then, of course, our climactic moment after we've met all these characters, we keep having these little conflicts. Boom, boom, boom. An employee gives a number, Mother Nature's skeptical. An employee gives an example, Mother Nature's skeptical. And then when she and Tim Cook, the CEO, face off in that long, weird stare off, and he wins, he stands his ground, kind of making this metaphorical statement that even though the world has had their fair share of greenwashing, of being told an organization is sustainable, but then it's not really, so that we're skeptics in the world, right? And this is this metaphorical story saying, but we're not just giving you the line, we're really trying to commit it. So Madeline, if there were a 30-second version of the ad, wouldn't that be great to get it condensed down? Maybe there is. I don't know. I haven't looked for it. I love seeing the story arc that happens in this one. Now, I don't know about you. I don't have the production capacity that Apple does. So I'm not going to be able to make these fully acted, well staged. This probably had 6 different cameras and tons of editors. I've just got me for most of the days that I'm telling my stories. So let me give you a couple of other examples of storytellers without any production value to it, just you telling your story. So the first one that I want to share is this idea that and Shelby, we can bring back the PowerPoint when you get it there, is this idea of this using stories to make a point. So one of the lessons that I frequently find myself teaching to new managers or new director level folks is that they need to create learning environments. Okay, so let's say that's the point that I'm making. And I would say that first. I would start out with, hey, as leaders, one of the most important things we can do for our organizations is to create a learning environment, a place where it's safe to try new things, to experiment, which by default means we will fail, to learn from those failures and grow. And whenever I tell that, when I'm trying to make that point, I tell the story about Tom Watson Sr., that at the end of the Depression had kind of kept IBM afloat by continuing to build up inventory, despite the fact that there was nobody could afford to buy it. So now the Depression is ended, the economy's starting to turn. He needs to sell off all of this inventory, and they need to start bringing in money. So a $1 million government contract comes up, and he needs it. IBM needs it, and he sends. Watson sends his very best sales rep off to Washington, D.C. to try to get this contract. And the sales rep comes back, he does his very best. He does, all the things he's learned how to do. And he tries this and he tries that, and he comes back and he did not get the contract. Okay, so he has failed in his mission. And it could mean the very death of IBM, or at very least of Tom Watson's CEO tenure, because the board, his head's on the chopping block as far as the board is concerned. So the rep is thinking to himself, I really don't want to get fired. We're right at the end of a bad economy. Of getting a new job is going to be hard enough, let alone if I've been terminated. So he writes up his letter of resignation, hoping that Watson will let him resign instead of being terminated. And he goes to Watson's office when he gets called in, and here we go. And Watson said, what happened? And the sales rep tells him, I tried this and I did this, and if I could do it differently again, these are the 3 things I wouldn't do. And here are the 2 things I would do that I didn't this time. But I know we were counting on this, and I've let you down, and I know we needed it. I'm hopeful you will accept my resignation. And Tom Watson says, no, I won't. And the rep's like, oh no, I'm going to get fired. This is going to be so bad. And then Watson said, why would I let you resign? Or why would I fire you? I just spent $1 million training you. You will never make those same mistakes again. Now, that's the kind of learning culture we need to create as leaders. As Peter Grulrich in his essays on leadership titles the essay where I pulled this story from, we forgive thoughtful mistakes. How can we learn as an organization to forgive thoughtful mistakes, to encourage thoughtful mistakes, to see it as part of the learning curve? So that's a story that I tell frequently. You could see the context. I set up that it was Depression era. Tom Watson needed the sale. We've got the characters, Watson and the sales rep. We've got the moment of tension, that conflict moment. He goes into his office. He's hoping not to get fired. Oh, he won't accept his resignation. And then sort of the conclusion is Watson won't only not fire him, he won't even let him resign, because this is a training exercise for him. This was how education happens. So again, that's just a story that you can tell. It took no video cameras, it took no editing team, but it drives home the point that I wanted to make. I want to show you one more example and then talk about how to source these different stories. So this next example, the woman that's talking her name is Jacqueline Novogratz. She's the CEO and founder of the Acumen Fund. And in this very short clip, and I think 3 minutes max, she manages to weave in not 1, but 2 stories and a simile, which is like a parable, a metaphor, but a simile at the very end of the 2 stories, all to make her point that leaders need humility. So she's already set that up as the lesson to be learned. She's made the main point. That's one of the things as we tell stories, sometimes as an attention grabber, you might want to just jump into a story. But if you're using a story within a larger presentation, it's usually best to say what your claim is first. Like I would say when I tell the Watson story, we need to create safe spaces for people to learn, which means making mistakes. I would say that first, instead of just telling the story where people would be thinking, why is she telling us this random story about IBM in the 1940s, right? So Jacqueline has set up that leaders need to have humility, and that's the point that she wants to make. And then she's also set a little bit of context. You won't hear a lot of it, but or maybe you will hear some of this in this clip, but she sets up this context that a French-speaking donor has donated an electric stove to a bakery that has no electricity. All right. So that's the plot here. That's the setup of the story. Let's watch Jacqueline tell stories looking for the 4 C's in both her stories. See if you can hear the context, find her characters. What's that conflict moment? And how does the story resolve? What's the conclusion? So Shelby's got a great clip for us from Jacqueline Novogratz.
In fact, one of the funniest stories I had, because I spoke French and Swahili at the time, and I was at the bakery where a Dutch, French-speaking donor had bought this electric stove for this bakery that had no electricity, and he came in to say to the women, what did you think, and how is it helping you, and are you using it? And the women, Priska was the only person who spoke French, so the rest of the women would be like, tell the dog that we don't have electricity, and what is he thinking about? And she would say, oh, it works really well, thank you very much. We just thank you. I was like, seriously? The market teaches you very quickly whether people want something or don't want something, and yet there still needs to be this leadership, humility. At Acumen, we also invest in leaders, and so we have a leaders program from around the world, and a young leader from Uganda, Joseph Byarahanga, who came from a farming family himself, was working in Western Kenya, where we've got a company that sells hybrid seeds to about 150,000 smallholder farmers. And he was saying to us just this year how humbled he was, because he went to this one household and the woman had no money. And so he said, look, take this packet of 501 seeds because it's drought resistant and we're probably going to have a drought this year. And when you see the benefits of it, then next year you can buy the seeds. And so she agreed, and he went off feeling like he had really gotten a new customer. And he said he came back a month later and the seeds were still sitting on the table. And he said, why didn't you use the seeds? And she said, well, in my culture, I can't plant these seeds until my mother-in-law plants her seeds. And you didn't give her seeds. And he said, I'm an African who lives 200 miles away from her, and I didn't know my own people. And he said, to me, leadership is like a panicle of rice, he said, because in your prime, you're nourishing the world, and you're reaching up to the heavens, and you're bright green and beautiful. And he said, but right before the harvest, that rice bends down and touches the ground with humility. And he said, I'll never forget that bending down to the ground as part of what it means for me as an African man who wants to change this world, that I have to start by listening. And it was just, no one could say it better than.
So hopefully you heard the characters in the first story. We've got the donor, we've got the women in the bakery that are just disgusted that he gave them a completely useless stove. And then you've got the mediator, the interpreter that's working between them saying, oh no, we don't want to hurt his feelings. So we'll just tell him it was lovely, even though we could never use it. So we've got those 4 characters. We've got that climactic moment where the women are like, ask the dog, what is he thinking? And then her not giving him really good feedback because she wants to protect the ego of this leader, this donor. And then in her second story, we've got the characters of the woman that gets the seeds, and the seed sales rep, and their interaction of why didn't you, the climax is that, why didn't you use these seeds? Well, because you didn't give my mother-in-law seeds, and in my culture this. And then the lesson learned is reiterated there. And then I saw in the comments that Ashwara had asked, do analogies make a story more impactful? And so we heard Jacqueline Novogratz there use that simile at the end, or the analogy at the end of a panicle of rice, tall and head up in its prime, but right before harvest, it bows down. So that's a kind of metaphor, a simile or an analogy. And so I would ask the group, do you think it made the story more impactful? And if so, we have our answer to Ashwara's story. I do think analogies that compare to something that's easy for people to understand can make stories really impactful. So you've seen you've heard two stories from Jacqueline, my IBM story and the Apple Spot, all to help you see the 4 C's of storytelling. You're picking those 4 C's out, great. But of course, that's not your only challenge. You have to be able to integrate those 4 C's into your own storytelling. And we have to do that with some degree of consistency. And this takes us to Erin's great question about how do we keep sourcing and finding these stories without just feeling just done out by all of it? So I wanted to give you some examples of where I've sourced my stories. The IBM story, of course, just comes from general reading. So keep your reading up, and that might help you find great stories. Always credit where the story came from, of course, in an ethical use of the story, credit the original source. But that's a great source for it. I think another place that I find a lot of my stories are current events. So the cell phone crash, the whole system crashing, and millions of people being without any cell service late last week, I think, and watching the reactions of people has given me a story that I'm going to lead a thought piece with. I'm going to start with that story and then the thought piece will be around how uncomfortable we are being disconnected, even to the point that we may be avoiding quiet reflection and the type of deep, thoughtful work that really keeps our performance at its best. But I'm using that current event as the jumping off point for this piece that I'll write on thoughtfulness and reflection. CJ says, when I heard the analogy, I pictured the seed salesman bowing his head. I bet he did. I bet as he told that story, he did. I love that. Different audiences, but the anecdote has more application to my day. Yeah, Madeline. Oh, yeah. All of our stories need to be audience centric. When we know, I use different, sometimes I can get away with the same story with different audiences, but especially with metaphors and analogies, I'm trying to pull from things that are very well known to the audience. So yeah, all of our stories need to be audience centric. Thanks for reminding us of that. Okay, so reading, current events, 2 great places to source good stories. Another one is just your own life stories. So I just did a piece that I posted not this past Friday, but the Friday before, I think, about something my daughter did when she was little. She kind of imitated me, and not in a very flattering way, but it was this really honest sort of self-reflection moment for me. I start a lot of my trust building workshops with a story from real life where I saw a leader kind of close his eyes to some things that were going on around him because he wanted to trust his second in command. And actually that person didn't have his back. And so he shouldn't have trusted him. But it's this great story to introduce it always stimulates such a good conversation among people that are trying to learn more about trust. And when should we trust? And is there a time when we should quit trusting? And when is that time? And if we don't trust first, can we expect to engender trust? So that story that I tell from life experiences tends to bubble things up. And then one last place that I wanted to tell folks about, and Erin, I hope you're still with us for this, is using generative AI as a source for stories. So I wanted a story recently. I needed to tell a story about a determined business leader. And I just didn't have anything that came to mind immediately. So I used ChatGPT. You can use whatever generative AI you're using. And I typed in, give me a hypothetical story about a very determined business leader. And with that prompt, what I got back was really generic. It was nothing I could use. It was like, oh, we'll tell you the story of Sarah Jones, who overcame great adversity. And I was like, So then I refined my prompt and I tried again. And I said, well, what field does Sarah work in? What was the adversity that she faced? And it got a little better. It said, okay, well, she works in IT and she was trying to do this startup project. And the adversity was that she lost her primary source of funding for the initiative. And then I refined again. I said, well, how did she overcome the adversity? And I get back, well, she pivoted and she came up with a new source of funding. And that was still a little generic. But when it said pivoted, I remembered I've got this great story about a leader who pivoted. The whole department was kind of moving against a certain new technology. And she was able to say, wait a minute, what what could we do if instead of fighting this, we just embrace it instead of pushing back? If we become the initiators of the user, the cutting edge users of this. And she pivoted a whole department, maybe even more than a department, maybe an entire organization by this pivot. So I ended up not even using the story that the generative AI came up with, but in this conversation I had with ChatGPT, it did lead me to a story that I did end up using in one of the presentations I was making. So life stories, current events, reading that you're doing, and ChatGPT or other generative AIs as a starting point, at least. It's always easier to get a story started and then you edit it like crazy after a generative AI at least gives you something to reflect to. Sometimes that's gets you past that writer's block or past that brainstorming moment. It's your brainstorming buddy, and not that you'll ever use anything verbatim that generative AI writes, but it'll at least give you a good start. So I hope that helps. All right, we are at 10:40 or 2:40 in my time. I promised you I'd get you out of here in about 30 minutes. So Jay asked, can a story have a connection with an emotional intelligence? I think absolutely that our stories are tapping into EI. One of the quadrants of emotional intelligence is empathy. And I think one of the reasons stories resonate so much is they become more than brain, they become heart and belly for us. We start to feel into the characters' lives in a story. And so we're tapping empathy when we tell a good story. And that's the reason reading good fiction builds our empathy, is because we experience someone's life, even through fiction, that we would never otherwise have had any sense of what that was like. And it builds our empathy, our tolerance, our inclusivity. So that's great. Okay, and let's see, what else did we have here? Leaders need you, and start by listening. Yeah, Madeline, that clip with the anecdote was a great one, wasn't it? Leaders need humility. We do that by starting to listen. And if you could bookend your story with those kinds of clear, crisp learning outcomes from the story and drive it home. And people may not remember much else that happened in that conference that Jacqueline was in, but they're not going to forget both of those stories, because stories stick. This has been a lot of fun. If you want some follow-up, Tatiana and I have a course that I think Shelby will put a link to it. It's in our communication tips course, but there's one specific video that's about storytelling and deconstructing stories. So if you want a little follow-up, there's that. There's a lot of great resources on the market for storytelling. I'm doing a whole focus through May on storytelling. So come back to some more LinkedIn Lives. We'll be looking at different nuances of storytelling. And in fact, next month, we're going to be looking specifically at storytelling as a persuasive tool, which from your comments when you logged in seems like how many of you are using stories. So our guest, Daisy Lovelace, who's also a LinkedIn author with some great content in the library, she'll be joining us to talk about persuasion, the way she sees it and the way she frames it. And she and I were also going to talk about a game that we play when we teach people persuasive principles. And so for those of you who do coaching or training of others, I think you'll find this really a really helpful and good discussion. And it's always great to have Daisy online too. So thank you all for coming, for your great thoughts. It was wonderful. I'll scan back through the comments in case we missed anything and make sure I reach out with more information about that. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day.